A black man in Georgia would go through a modern day lynching back in 1983. It would take nearly 35 years for him to finally get his justice. Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Timothy Coggins. Viewer discretion is advised. Timothy Wayne Coggins was born on August 29th, 1960. I don't have a ton of background information on him, unfortunately, but he was one of 8 siblings. He was kind of, I guess, in the middle of the group. And the family lived in Griffin, Georgia. The Coggins family was like a super tight-knit, very close, very loving family. Tim's siblings would describe him as basically like the best brother anyone could possibly ask for. He was closest with one of his sisters who was just a couple years younger than him. Her name was Talissa. I guess Tim took her under his wing, and he basically just sort of showed her the ropes of life. He taught her how to ride a bike. He taught her all the best and safest ways to walk home from certain locations. When Talissa was 18, she got pregnant, she had a baby, and Tim was the very first person to meet the new baby, and he was so excited to be an uncle. Tim was also someone who loved to party. He was a very outgoing individual, very full of life. Nothing ever seemed to get him down. He loved to dance and just let loose, and he didn't care who saw him do it. In public, basically it said that Tim never knew a stranger. He always would just talk to anyone, even if he had never met them before, and it was like they had known each other forever. And he just always seemed to have a giant smile on his face. Now, this is the early 80s, and in this particular part of Georgia, it was not exactly safe to be a black person. And in this part of Georgia, God forbid a black man try to dance with or even possibly date a white woman. That you couldn't do that. Well, unfortunately, Timothy Coggins seemed to make that fatal mistake. It was the evening of October 9th, 1983. That evening, Timothy was at a club called the People's Choice Club. It was basically almost exclusively kind of like an all-black location. Not many white people would really ever go in there. The club was in this kind of quiet part of town. It was just sort of down the end of this rural country road. It wasn't really surrounded by much. It kind of was just its own place, He was there that night with his sister Talissa. It was a Friday night, so it was very busy. The club was popping off. It was packed. It was loud. Everyone was dancing, laughing, drinking, having a great time. Timothy, of course, was out on the dance floor where he felt the most free, and he was just having the time of his life. That night and other nights in recent months leading up to this, Tim was seen on the dance floor dancing with a particular white woman. There were rumors, I guess, that perhaps the two of them were dating, kind of, but that part's kind of unclear. Interracial relationships in this part of Georgia, especially, were met with anger and animosity and just a lot of hate. There was actually still a very active Klan chapter in this part of Georgia. This group would still have Klan rallies. They would have their meetings. They would be out in public, roaming the streets. They would still burn crosses. They would still do all that evil shit. So anyway, that night, Talissa she was in the club with her brother. She at one point went to the ladies' room, and when she came out of it just a few minutes later, she couldn't find Tim. He wasn't on the dance floor. He wasn't anywhere. So she had asked around, and she was told that apparently a couple of white men were parked out front of the club, and they had been screaming and asking specifically for Tim. So apparently Tim obliged, and he left the club and met up with these white men. that no one identified to anyone. Talissa and Timothy's family in general would never see Timothy alive again. At first, everyone kind of just thought, oh, Tim did one of his like sporadic trips with these men. Maybe he was friends with them because he was friends with everyone, basically. It was not unheard of for Tim to just take a very sporadic, out of nowhere trip and be gone for like days at a time without his family ever hearing from him. This was just stuff he did. So no one really thought much of it. But like, okay, this is just Tim. You know, they were like, okay, Tim, he'll just reappear in a few days and everything is fine. Tim did reappear in a few days, but it's not the way his family had expected. Unfortunately, Tim reappeared a few days after he was last seen, and this time he was deceased. Approximately 36 hours after he was seen at the club leaving, two hunters were hunting in the woods just off of, I guess, a road called Minter Road. And this was near like a trailer park, kind of like literally just a few hundred yards away. So these two hunters found the body of a black male. This body had on a pair of blue jeans that were kind of pulled down a little bit. He also had on this like blue pullover sweatshirt, and he had no t-shirt on underneath, even though the last time Timothy was seen, he had on a white t-shirt underneath his sweater. But now it's gone. So police were called, and the crime scene was looked at, and the coroner would take the body. The coroner would determine that Timothy had over 24 stab wounds. He had many defensive wounds on his hands and arms, as if, they could tell he was fighting back. He was really trying to stop this, but unfortunately, he didn't win in the end. Most shockingly, I guess, even though the whole thing is shocking, he had this X carved into like his kind of chest area. People looked at it and said, that kind of looks like the Confederate flag. Back at the crime scene, they found blood kind of caked into the dirt near some like tire tracks. They had like shoe impressions, but they weren't super clear shoe impressions. The tire tracks didn't really yield much because they weren't completely discernible. But the blood stains kind of caked into the dirt would tell them that this is likely where Timothy was stabbed. And this is the crime scene where he was ultimately killed. A few yards away from where his body was found, they found a what looked like a wooden chair leg that had been broken, and it was sort of wrapped in like electrical tape or some kind of black tape. Timothy did also have some blunt force trauma injuries to his body, so they looked at this chair leg and they pretty much would come to the conclusion that this was likely something that was used to beat him. They also discovered a bunch of injuries to like his back, and they were injuries consistent with someone being dragged at a high speed. So what they would determine was that he was likely chained or tied to the back of a vehicle, and he was dragged for some time. The coroner determined that his cause of death was from blood loss, which means that when he was stabbed and basically left there in the woods, Timothy was still alive. He endured all of the beating, the stabbing, being dragged down a road for God knows how long, and he was then just left to die in a cold, open field, and he suffered. He was in pain for, they don't really even know how long, until he finally died from blood loss. This was a modern day lynching. Based on witness statements from the club and from just people in Timothy's life, they determined that this, with him dancing with this white woman at the club, that may have sparked the entire motive for why this crime happened. Again, this is a not friendly part of town for the black community. They also had evidence, I guess, of like a possible drug dealings, that Timothy may have either taken drugs from someone without paying, or he was given drugs with like a timetable to pay, but he never paid. something along the lines of money being involved in some kind of drug transaction that Timothy was on the wrong side of. And this drug dealer was likely a white man. But then, kind of out of nowhere, the detective who had been working on his case was suddenly just pulled off the case. And a new person was reassigned to it. And then the police basically said, this case has reached a dead end. What? They had barely even started to investigate. How are we at a dead end? They just stopped investigating this case altogether. Just completely stopped it. And then Tim's family would get threats, constant threats all the time. One day, Tim's stepdad, who drove, a school bus, he went into the school bus one morning before picking up, all the kids, and there was a bloody white t-shirt found just sitting there right where on the seat where he would be driving. On a couple other occasions, people would take a brick and throw it through the Coggins house windows. And tied to those bricks were notes that said, "You're next." One day, and I hate to even mention this, but it needs to be said because of the brutality of all of this, and to understand how severe this was, one day the family found a decapitated dog in their house. All of this told the family exactly what they suspected and feared the whole time. This was a racially motivated crime. Now they are getting threats from the white community, basically saying, you stop looking into this or else. It also told the family that police stopped investigating this case because, Tim's a black man and who cares? And then Timothy Coggins' case just faded away. It just faded into a dark corner in a box and just collected dust and sat there and just disappeared. And Timothy, at least from the police perspective, was just forgotten. Forgotten until 2017. One day in 2017, the sheriff's department would call a member of the Coggins family. And the phone call, the sheriff's person just said to them, "We know who killed Timothy. We got him." Came to a complete shock to Timothy's family because they didn't even know that they were even actively investigating this anymore. Well, apparently a year prior in 2016, a newly hired junior investigator decided to, work on some cold cases. And he found Timothy's box, basically, his case. And he decided, I'm going to solve this. I'm going to figure this out. And apparently all of the people who had been working on this case back in 1983, most of them were either retired or dead. In 2016, when the new investigator opened the case, the box, there wasn't really much. The investigator was kind of shocked, I guess, by the lack of things in this box. He did notice that, I guess, in the police records, that there was two men who police had, I guess, talked to or had been told about. A man named Frankie Gebhardt and his brother-in-law, William Bill Moore. They were two white men who lived in the trailer park that was just a few hundred yards away from where Timothy's body was found. Frankie Gebhardt came up in conversation a lot in terms of people kind of pointing the finger at him. But police only interviewed him one time, and it was for a very brief time. And then there was absolutely no records of them ever interviewing him ever again, or them ever doing any digging into him or his life whatsoever. Bill Moore, they didn't even bring in for an interview. They did have, I guess, a paper with Frankie's alibi on it, but then there was like a whole bunch of holes in his alibi that it either didn't make sense or that he was lying about it, but police never looked into it back in 1983. Then this investigator found out that a man named Christopher Vaughn, who back when this happened was only a 10-year-old boy, well, I guess he was now in jail at the time of this case being reopened. He wrote investigators, now in the 2000s, close to 2016, with notes and letters that basically said, listen, I I have information on the Timothy Coggins case. I know who did this. And he had tried to tell police over the years back then, but they just ignored him, or they just brushed him aside and said, just go away, kid, basically. But now this investigator he talks to Christopher. Christopher says that back then, because Christopher was he was in the group of hunters that actually discovered Timothy's body. But then days after the body was found, this 10-year-old kid who was around this circle of men who lived in this trailer park, he said that Frankie Gebhardt confessed and admitted to killing Timothy, not just once, but many times. He even said that Frankie admitted to throwing the murder weapon, the actual knife, because it was never found back then, and other items that belonged to Timothy down a well that was on Frankie's property. And as the years go by, Frankie Gebhardt, in earshot or either directly to Christopher, just kept talking about it, bragging about it, that he did it, that he just kept confessing. And every time Christopher kept trying to go to police, they would just say, go away. And it was unbelievable because as this new investigator is now hearing this information directly from Christopher, he's looking in the box of evidence, he's looking through the files, and there is nothing about this. So police back now in 2016, they try to interview both of these men. When Bill Moore is brought in for questioning, this man says, I've never even heard of the murder. Nope, never heard of it ever in my life. Don't even know who Timothy Coggins is, even though he definitely lived in the trailer park where the body had been found a couple hundred yards away. He was an active member of that community. And now he's saying he never even heard of it, which is obviously bullshit. When police are kind of looking into this further, they find documents elsewhere that unbelievably members of the police department, sheriff's department back then were active members in the local Klan chapter. So this wasn't about police just being lazy and not caring and just not doing their job. This was them, the police, being complicit, essentially, in Timothy's murder or covering up the murder. At any rate, Frankie Gebhardt at this time now, many decades later, he is also in jail because of an unrelated sexual assault. Whoa, shocker. When he sat down with police, he just said, I don't know a damn thing about it. Don't know anything about him. Don't know who he is. Never heard of him. Never heard of the crime. Don't know anything. Oh, they're saying I did it, that I admitted to doing it? Well, they're lying. But then he also told police, well, to be honest with you, I've been a bit of a drunk most of my life. And so there's a lot of things I don't remember. They then tried to ask him, well, what about this well? They're saying you threw things down your well, like the murder weapon and items that Timothy owned. And he's like, well, then go dig up the damn well then, and you're going to find nothing. They showed a photo of Timothy Coggins to him. And he says to them, I ain't never seen that before. He said, I ain't never seen that N-word. This man lived in this trailer park for the majority of his adult life back then. He was a dropout. He dropped out in junior high, not even in high school, so he had a very poor education. He worked in the logging industry when he was a younger adult. He hosted parties all the time with sex being involved, alcohol, drugs. He was a partier. He and his brother-in-law were known to be two very violent people. One time, I guess, they killed a cow in their kitchen. And they were always in and out of jail. So, with this revelation by Christopher Vaughn that said, that Frankie had admitted to the killing, this investigator tracked down other witnesses and other friends of Frankie and Bill who were still around, and this investigator discovered that, it wasn't just Christopher he admitted to killing Timothy to. He actually had bragged and admitted to many people over the years, and many people either just hid that information out of fear or because maybe they were complicit because they were, white supremacists, or they did go to police, but police said, go away. Apparently, the majority of these confessions that Frankie had given to these people over the years was a very consistent theme that Timothy Coggins was dancing with and potentially dating a white woman. And I guess they've just referred to this white woman as Mickey. And apparently this was a girlfriend or someone very close to Frankie Gebhardt. And so, well, him being a white supremacist, he didn't like that. So Timothy needed to die for it. This woman, by the way, Mickey, and that was just like a nickname they gave her, she died in 2010, so the investigator could not talk to her. So basically, the story is that both Frankie and Bill Moore, they found out that Timothy was at the club that night. They went to the club. They screamed for him to come out. He did. They took him, and they brought him to an area known as the Hanging Tree. That's when they beat him with a table leg. They dragged him with a chain behind their truck. And then they brought him underneath the hanging tree where they stabbed him multiple times until he was dead. And then they carved the Confederate flag symbol into his chest, stomach area. And unfortunately, most of the physical evidence that was collected back then was mysteriously gone and missing forever. So they didn't have, there were, I guess, were items with like, back then that would have had DNA on them, items that would, they found, I guess, a piece of hair that didn't match or that wouldn't have possibly have belonged to Timothy at the crime scene. They had all this like physical evidence that was now just gone forever. And it's pretty clear that they probably just sort of destroyed the evidence because, well, they're part of the Klan, some of these police officers. So they were lacking a lot of evidence because they hadn't gotten any confessions directly from Frankie or Bill Moore. They were relying solely on witness testimony. So they needed something. And so they realized, well, this well, he threw some stuff down this well. Where I guess the well was now, I guess, was built over, something was built over it. And it was hard for them to just like dig up the well because it would ruin the foundation of this home. So they had to get creative. They had to, I guess, they brought in some team who would, I guess, pump water or force water into the well in order to bring up some of the debris at the bottom of this well. And it wasn't like your traditional well, like you would see, it was one of those, like, basically, it was directly into the ground and in this small, like, circular opening. And at any rate, they had this group of people come in and they brought up a bunch of debris. They kind of were able to go down there, bring up a bunch of trash and crap that they just sort of dumped and they were like sorting through. And eventually they found an absolute treasure trove. They found a pair of Adidas shoes that they determined that were made in the 80s. It was also determined they likely belonged to Timothy because when he was found, he did not have his shoes on. And his family said he was wearing a pair of Adidas that were missing when they found him. So they determined that these were his shoes. They also found a white t-shirt that had been like torn to shreds. It had blood all over it. It had a bunch of like, what looked like stab, marks to it. And it was a nightmare. And they determined that this was the missing shirt, that Timothy was wearing that night that was no longer on him when they found him. And then they found a wooden handle to what looked like a steak knife. And then they found the blade of that knife separate. So now they have multiple pieces of Timothy Coggins' clothing, that what they determined was his clothing and his blood. They also found what they believed was the murder weapon. Prosecutors knew, though, they would still have a pretty tough case to do because, the knife and the clothes found in the well, which used to be Frankie Gebhardt's property, there wasn't any physical evidence to suggest that Frankie was the one to have put those things down there. So they still had to rely on a lot of the witness testimony. And they had to establish that motive. And so they brought up many witnesses who, first of all the witnesses who claimed that Frankie had confessed to the murder, and all of those witness statements were basically identical. They were consistent with the stories that Frankie told them. And The prosecution also brought up witnesses, and they showed proof that Frankie Gebhardt had been dating a woman that matched the description of the same white woman that Timothy was dancing with over the course of weeks at this club. And they determined that person was this Mickey woman. So that established a motive. They also established that Frankie Gebhardt was an incredibly racist man. He used racial slurs all the time. He was very open about his disdain and hatred for black people. Not to mention his criminal history, his assault records, everything that kind of would show that he was a violent person. Frankie's defense was still like, this is all just weak circumstantial evidence. They don't have any physical evidence. It's all made up. There's way too much reasonable doubt. But in the end, because of Frankie Gebhardt's gigantic mouth and the fact that the testimony of all the witnesses who said he confessed to it were all extremely consistent and identical, plus Timothy Coggins' clothing items that he was wearing that night were found down a well on a property where Frankie Gebhardt lived back then, it was basically signed, sealed, delivered. The jury came back fairly quickly with a guilty verdict. Frankie Gebhardt was found guilty on all charges related to the murder of Timothy Coggins. Frankie Gebhardt was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Bill Moore, he wouldn't go to trial. He instead would plead guilty to manslaughter. He was there when the murder took place, but he himself did not stab Timothy. However, he was in the vehicle when he was dragged, and he also helped hide evidence, and he lied about his involvement. He would end up getting a 20-year sentence. 3 other people were arrested in connection with this case. A woman named Sandra Bunn, who I guess back then either lived with Frankie Gebhardt or I'm not exactly sure, but she knew about the murder and she withheld information from police and deliberately hid her knowledge of the murder. And then I guess an individual named Lamar Bunn, who was related to Sandra, both of those two were actually working with the police department now. And Lamar Bunn, I think wasn't even, I don't even think he was alive. He wasn't even around then. But he then knew of information about the case decades after it happened. And so he withheld, I guess they had evidence that he knew about all of it, but then withheld information and didn't say anything. And so he was charged in relation to that. And then another man named Gregory Huffman, again, obstruction of justice charges. He knew about it and did nothing and said nothing. And he did all of this with intent. He intended to hide it. The 3 additional people, I don't think got much time, if anything, just because they weren't involved directly with the murder, but they were punished. And the 2 individuals who had been working for the police department when they were arrested, they were obviously fired. Timothy Coggins was buried back in 1983 in an unmarked grave. This was because they knew if they put Timothy Coggins' name on this headstone, on this grave, that his resting place would be defiled. It would be dug up. It would be, there people in the area, the white people in the area, they would defile his grave. And so they had to leave it nameless for so long. And it wasn't until after Frankie Gebhardt and Bill Moore were finally put away for their atrocities that they were finally able to give Timothy Coggins his own headstone with his name and everything. And now they can say that Timothy Coggins is finally resting in peace, that Timothy finally got the justice he so badly deserved. And to show the character that the Coggins family has, after the trials were over, you know, members of Timothy's family would look at members of the guilty's family and say, we're so sorry this happened to your family as well. And essentially they gave their forgiveness. So that's pretty remarkable given the circumstances. But that is it for this case, True Crime-a-roonies. I hope you found it interesting. As usual, if you have tripped, fallen, and stumbled your way into this video and seen me for the very first time, hello, I'm Mike. I tell true crime stories. I tell 4 a week here on YouTube, 1 on Instagram, 1 on Facebook, and then a few throughout the week over on TikTok. Please subscribe to me here, give this video a like so more people can see it, and then check the link tree in the description below and follow my other socials if you so choose. If there's a case you want me to cover, please email me. That email is listed in the description as well. Just email me the name of the person, where it happened, when it happened, and I will eventually add it to my list. I do choose my cases at random, so I will cover it eventually. I just can't tell you when. Next, if you'd like to support me in any way, we do sell merch like this shirt here and others, and other items as well. We do ship internationally, so it's also in the link tree below if you want to purchase any of it. If you have a Discord account and you want to join my Discord server, please feel free to do so, also in the link tree. Be over the age of 18 though, or else you will be kicked out. Sorry, not sorry. Let's finish today's video with another dad joke courtesy of Live, Laugh, Lose. My throat's hurting today, so I'm not going to do the impression part. Here we go. Local man killed by falling piano. They're going to keep the funeral low-key. Low-key. Yeah. Okay, well, that was the dumbest thing I've ever heard, but I can't take it back, so. Why do fish live in salt water? Because pepper makes them sneeze. Nope, swing and a miss. Okay, swing and a miss. Thought maybe we could recover with a sudden second joke, but no, we cannot. So, oh, okay, well, bye. Bye.